Welcome to the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. This is Dr. Gordon Walker, and this week we're going to talk about mushrooms and mental health. So, this is a subject near and dear to my heart because mental health is a big deal, and we don't always get to talk about it in society, but I think it's worth addressing how mushrooms and all the different ways that they can help us with our mental health. But before I dive into that, I just want to mention a couple quick things. This is the last week that you guys can register to come for a hike with me on June 4th. I'll be hiking up in the Pollock Pines area of the foothills here in California. And we'll probably be looking for morels, but maybe also some spring porcini. And if you'd like to come for the whole weekend, we do have a couple of spots left. We have one double occupancy room and two twin beds that are also available. There will be like a mushroom cooking class, mushroom education cocktail hour, a couple of really nice meals put together by Julie Schreiber and I. It should be a really fun weekend. So if you guys are interested in that, go to fascinatedbyfungi.com, click on the banner for more details there. The long and short of it is that if you'd like to register for the hike, you can send $200 per person to Fascinated by Fungi on Venmo or PayPal, and then I will follow up with you by email. Anyhow, that should be a great weekend. I hope that we have enough people to get out there and have a really good time in the woods. We're going to be doing it regardless now. So, if you want to be a part of it, please come join us. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I have some Fascinated by Fungi merch. There's lots of good stuff on my website. If you guys would love to support me, I would really appreciate it. I do have original designs on my website that I've worked with artists and commissioned artists paying them for these designs. So I love to support small artists and I'd like to do more of them. So every time you guys buy a t-shirt, I'm able to go out and potentially solicit more artists and get more designs done. I think that's really cool because when I got into mushrooms, I realized there was sort of just the same things repeated time and time again. Like I just saw a bunch of Amanita muscaria t-shirts all over the place, but I was like, I'd really love to see more diversity of different kinds of mushroom stuff. So that's my merch, is sort of focusing on all the different cool kinds of mushrooms that there are out there. I also have a Patreon, so if you'd like to support me directly, you can subscribe to my Patreon. And if you don't want to spend any money, but you'd still love to support me, I would appreciate that. You can watch my videos here on YouTube. You can listen to my podcast on Apple and Spotify and Callin. You can leave reviews, hopefully positive ones. Anything you do to interact with my accounts on social media, share them, follow them, send to your friends and family, all that kind of stuff is greatly appreciated. I do want to mention that I'm going to be doing some more work with North Spore in the future. They're a great mushroom company out of Maine. They sell a lot of stuff, including some great sort of mushroom supplements that are made from whole fruiting bodies, and I really like these. I've been taking some of these. I got a cold earlier this week, and I've been taking their immunity multi-mushroom extract capsules, which have chaga, reishi, turkey tail, maitake, and shiitake. And I only had really 1 or 2 days of actually feeling pretty bad about this cold. I was a little afraid I had COVID, but I got a test, and I didn't. I just had an honest-to-goodness cold. It happens sometimes. But I definitely felt like I got better sooner by taking some mushroom supplements. So, maybe there is some value to taking mushroom supplements, as skeptical as I can be about it. But I do appreciate that North Spore sells whole mushroom supplements, powdered and not just like an extract, because I think that's the best way to take them. And particularly what I love from North Spore is their mushroom grow kits and their other equipment for growing mushrooms. So they also sell uninoculated spawn bags you can get and inoculate your own spores of choice, but they have a great selection of different commercially cultivated mushrooms. So there's all sorts of oysters. They have some neat ones they've just put in these 5-pound bags. So I just got some Namikos. It's a Foliota species, really slimy, cool mushroom. So I'm making videos with those. My garden is completely inoculated with North Spore wine cap mushrooms, and I love how the wine cap mushrooms help me build soil. The soil is full of mycelium, holds onto a ton of water, and it's been really, really helpful here in Napa. It gets super hot because it helps my plants from drying out, and it keeps the soil way moister. Plus, when I water my tomato beds, I get mushrooms, which is awesome. So if you'd like to order from North Spore, you can use my discount code Fascinated by Fungi in all caps and save 10% on your order. North Spore also has that open L mushroom knife you see me using all the time. So if you'd like to get one of these knives, they are really handy. I was kind of skeptical at first, but I like how lightweight they are because the handle is wood, not metal or plastic. The curved blade keeps you from poking yourself, and the little brush is always helpful to knock off little bits of dirt, bugs, etc. So that's my spiel. We're going to jump into mushrooms and mental health now. So, sort of tell some kind of personal stories here about what mushroom hunting and mental health have meant for me. Back in 2017, when I was living in New Zealand, I got into mushroom hunting, and it was a function of me sort of, having time on my hand after grad school, needing something to do that wasn't just sitting around and writing a paper, because I was supposed to be working on a paper that I still had left over from graduate school. And anyone who's ever engaged in any form of academic writing probably knows that there's a bit of procrastination and anxiety that comes up when you have to sit down and do something like that, because doing academic writing can be very tedious. And the review process is, man, they'll just tear you to shreds if you don't do it right. So you really take the time to try to get it right. But as part of doing that work, I really needed a release. I needed something to kind of get away and change my mindset, because I was just like locked in the house alone. My partner had been working a bunch, so I was just like hanging out for most of the day by myself, kind of going crazy. And it was the sound of my own wheels in my own head that was driving me nuts. So I found that going out and going for hikes was helpful, but that the thing that really got me going was looking for mushrooms, because I'd always enjoyed hiking and being outside, but I was sort of curious, like, what was my motivation? It was not that compelling to just go outside and look at nature. Sure, it's nice, but what was I getting out of it? And as soon as I discovered that I could get mushrooms out of it, that I could get food out of it, oh man, then I was hooked. So the other thing that happened while I was in New Zealand was I lost a relative. And this was my aunt, who'd been very, very important to me growing up. And she dealt with a whole slew of her own mental health issues. And unfortunately, she passed away while I was in New Zealand. And it was really difficult for me. It was a hard way to lose somebody, kind of feel like I didn't get to say goodbye, and know that I didn't really have like a ton of contact with her in the last couple of years of her life. And I felt a lot of guilt about that. But it was okay, because I had something to kind of channel my energy into, and that was mushroom hunting. And I've talked to a lot of other people who have gotten into mushroom hunting at a period of their life when they really needed something. They didn't know exactly what it was, but they were dealing with grief, they were dealing with loss, they were dealing with a traumatic event. And mushroom hunting and being in the woods is something that kind of came to them as a very special way of reconnecting with nature and finding one's center after this kind of very sad moment of your life. And it wasn't like an all or nothing type of experience. It was something that comes about slowly. You feel like you've really lost something. You feel emotionally denuded. You feel numb, potentially. And going out into nature is just something that is a great distraction, and it can really help kind of shift your mindset a little bit as you start to notice all of these little minuscule details. And I think there's something to be said for that, because it's really important for us as human beings to spend time in nature, because we didn't evolve to live in little cubicles with fluorescent lighting. We evolved being out in nature. And I think it's fascinating how much of our lives we spend inside of buildings, inside of cars, inside of sort of man-made structures and environments where we don't get a lot of exposure to plants. And even if we do see plants, they're often these sort of very manicured plants. It's a very limited selection of things that we see that are used in landscaping. And, I know people think of like green fields as nature, but it is not. Grass is like a monoculture, and it's usually non-native grasses. And, they spray pesticides all over it to stop bugs from being there and from flowers coming up and all sorts of stuff like that. So like just seeing green isn't necessarily that useful, but it's very different experience to go out into actual habitat, into an environment where plants are diverse and growing, and it sort of changes you to some degree. And for me, it's been a really useful thing to be motivated to go find mushrooms there in the woods. It's helped me deal with anxiety. It helps me when I go out into the woods to put my phone down. I do use my phone a lot to take pictures and to document what I'm finding, but I'm not staring at social media. I'm not checking my text messages. I'm not looking at the score of the game. I'm using my phone in a very different way than I do the rest of the time. And I think that is useful because certainly our phones, as incredible as they are, also tap us into this sort of like manic, obsessive quality of always being connected. And I know people who love camping and going into nature certainly are aware of this, but like it really does make a difference even just to go for a walk and to not look at your phone while you're out there. Or if you do use your phone, you're documenting something, which is a very different feeling than like checking your text messages. Being out in the woods has also really helped me get exercise and become more healthy. I have struggled at points in my life with my weight, and I have certainly struggled with getting enough exercise. I always tried to run or bike or do these things, but it always sort of felt like a sliding down a hill, and I was just trying to grapple my way up by just doing little bits of exercise here and there. But getting out into nature and specifically looking for mushrooms was motivation enough to get me out more often. And doctors recommend that you do 3 or 4 times a week of 20 minutes of cardio, and that might seem not that much really, but it can be hard if you spend a lot of days inside or you're in an office building. It's actually hard to reach that 20-minute mark. And even when people do go for a walk, they usually don't get their heart rate high enough to really accomplish anything. So being out in the woods, just inherently when you're walking on trails or you are running around getting excited about a plant or a mushroom, it's going to cause your heart rate to elevate. It's going to cause you to push a little bit farther over the next hill because you're curious what's there. It's really motivating. And I find very much so that being out in nature and specifically mushroom hunting helps me with my focus, helps provide mental clarity, and just overall makes me feel a lot healthier and happier. Getting into foraging and mushroom hunting has also helped me with my diet because I'm eating a lot more mushrooms, and eating more mushrooms can make a diverse gut microbiome. There's a lot of really good things in mushrooms that are the polysaccharides that can very much benefit your microbiome and lead to diversity of bacteria in your gut that are associated with decreased inflammation, increased immune function, and also just better cognitive functioning in general. So foraging has definitely made me eat better, and I appreciate that about finding mushrooms out in the woods. It's also made me a lot more connected to the seasons and to nature sort of in general, because when I go out foraging, when I go looking for mushrooms, I often visit some of the same places, and I find it's interesting every single time I go out because it's not just like I'm looking at the exact same habitat every time. I'm seeing the same plants, I'm seeing the same trails, but every time I'm noticing something new, like, oh, maybe the buds on this plant have come out, or maybe the things that were buds are now flowers, or oh, wow, there's a lot more of this kind of bug or that kind of bug. I'm looking at the progression of different mushrooms and slime molds as the seasons go on. I'm seeing how things change as a function of the amount of rain there's been. I'm looking at like the effect of temperature. There's so many different factors to kind of consider that every time you go out for a walk, it's not necessarily a whole new world, but you start keying into these very specific key differences. And that's a science called phenology. It's this sort of observational science. And that's something that I really like doing because I go out and yes, I can kind of like understand the majority of what I'm going to see, but I love understanding all these little minute differences that there are out in nature. And that really absorbs me and gets me interested in what I can find. And watching that change seasonally is something that brings me great joy. So I really appreciate that about, mushroom hunting. And I think too, that ties us to our mental health, because also when we're aware of the seasons, we're aware of daylight. And certainly a big thing that happens in winter is there's a lot less daylight. You get less sun, you get less vitamin D, we're more prone to depression. But if you're mindfully practicing doing walks in the woods, you can get out during daylight hours, hopefully, or you make time to find that space in nature and get out there on a weekend. Or, ideally you have a job that provides you some flexibility so you can go out for part of the day. And I know for a lot of people who work from home, that's something that hopefully you can do. But if you're not doing it, it's a really good idea to just give yourself a 20-30 minute break to go walk around in the woods. And there's also a big difference there between walking around in like an urban environment versus walking in the woods. I highly recommend, as much as you can, if you have access to it, to get into something that's close to a park or a natural environment, or at least like an arboretum, somewhere where there's a lot of plants and you can kind of like forget the trappings of the world for a little bit. I do enjoy walking around my neighborhood, and I like looking at people's gardens, but it's a very different feeling when there's constantly trucks going by, or someone's dog is barking, or the noises of civilization are so different from the noises of being out in nature, where the birds or the stream or the other sounds are kind of taking precedent. And the other thing I love about getting into mushroom hunting and how it's improved my mental health is the community that it's helped me build, because being really into mushrooms has helped me find other massive mushroom nerds, and that's been great, especially in the wake of having my life kind of shaken up last fall. I wasn't sure what I was going to do or how I was going to find community, and leaning into other weird mushroom people has been great. I found the kinds of people that I want to spend time with. I found the kinds of people that I want to talk to and share things with. And I think that's just sort of an amazing side effect of getting into nature related stuff. Because even if it's not mushrooms you're into, if you're a weird bird person or an insect person or whatever, you'll find other people who are into that same niche community as you. And so there's a real boon for mental health when you connect with people who have shared interests and are similarly passionate about the same things that you are. So pulling away from my personal experience and sort of looking at this from a more scientific perspective, because that's part of what I do, there's a real science to all this. It's called forest bathing, or shirin-yoku is the term from Japan that has been coined there. And there are hundreds and hundreds of papers on this effect. Most of them published in Asian countries, but they've been thoroughly reviewed in a couple different things. I know I found a review from 2017 that took like 100 and something studies and narrowed it down to about 64 studies. They then did like meta-analysis on, and found a lot of commonalities between these studies and like the benefits of this stuff. One thing I want to mention too, before I move on fully this forest bathing thing, but like I personally think, and I know there's some data to back this up, but one of the best things you can do if you're dealing with addiction, trauma, depression, etc., is to do some of this forest bathing. And in particular, the practice of hunting mushrooms is something that I think really, really helps with addictive personalities and addictive tendencies. So if you're trying to quit smoking, or you're dealing with like getting off of a drug or something else that has created an addiction, even like say a sugar addiction, a caffeine addiction, some of these things are pretty common in society, think about getting into something like mushroom hunting, because it creates a healthy hobby for you to go outside, be in nature, which is always going to be good for you. It creates a feedback loop of dopamine and serotonin if you find a cool mushroom and you get excited about it. It's helping you wire new mental pathways in your brain because you find this new mushroom, you're excited about it, you want to learn about it, you end up reading about it, you end up researching it. Ideally, maybe it's something you can even eat, so you end up consuming it, and that's creating a lot of feedback for you to want to go out and do it again. So you are constructively getting yourself addicted to something new, but it's a healthy hobby with really no downside as long as you're doing things safely. And so I am very bullish on the idea of people dealing with trauma, depression, and addiction getting into mushroom hunting. And a lot of people that I've talked to that have gotten into mushroom hunting have often come from one of those backgrounds. As to whatever you're dealing with, it's a place where mushroom hunting comes along at a very important time in your life and gives you kind of the catharsis and focus and even community that maybe you're searching for, that you didn't have previously. And so mushroom hunting and getting into that mushroom community can help you from sliding backwards into that depression or that addiction or that sadness that you carry around with you. So anyway, forest bathing. is really cool. Shirin-yoku, like I was saying. There's a lot of sort of proven results, and this is like a meta-analysis from these 64 studies that were reviewed. So there's a lot of positive benefits for cardiovascular function, blood, endocrine, metabolic function, uh, positive impacts for immunity, inflammatory response, physical and emotional health. Can help alleviate depression and anxiety. And again, this is just the concept of going out and being in nature. Um, it can increase attention and focus, and even help people think about gratitude and selflessness, and sort of mindfulness practices. And like I was saying too, there's also some real scientific evidence that the exercise that people do in nature is better for you than the exercise you can do in an urban environment. So if you have a chance to go for a jog around like a reservoir or through local woods, it's probably going to be better for you than if you're like jogging in the downtown commercial district. And that's not that surprising, because jogging and smelling, nice air with plants around is going to be better than jogging around and smelling like trash and piss and, car exhaust kind of thing. And I know in cities it can be difficult to get away, but if you can look for those green spaces, it really does help. And I think a lot of cities are recognizing the impact of those green spaces and the value that they have to their residences, especially in terms of the way it can impact their mental health. I also saw one analysis that I thought was pretty interesting, where it's saying that the more trees that were around in a particular neighborhood, the better the mental health and the better physical health of its residences. And so that speaks to socioeconomic status too, in cities where often the lowest socioeconomic status areas have the least trees, have the least gardens, have the least green spaces for people to have access to. And so that's a real reason to have community gardens and beautify spaces in urban areas that have been, historically neglected. And so I do hope that there's some, upcoming work to help that happen in major urban areas of the United States in particular, because, the inequity gap there is huge with people's ability to access nature. And that makes me really sad. And, I think it would also probably be really good for our land, our soils, all these things, to bring back more trees to cities, to bring back ideally some fungal populations along with them, help those trees get established, help detoxify soils that have a whole bunch of heavy metals in them, stuff like that. But there's a lot of sensory effects that come from this forest bathing. It is very much sort of an all-encompassing experience. It's what you see, it's what you smell, it's what you hear, it's what you touch. It is all of the sensations that you have, somatic and visual and hearing, all this stuff. So there's the real core of some of this stuff is part of the molecules that you're going to be smelling in the air. There's a great paper on this called Forest Volatile Organic Compounds and Their Effects on Human Health. It was published in 2020. And it talks about particularly terpenes, limonene, pinene, these molecules that are put off by plants as like communication molecules, are things that we pick up in our system and can have positive effects on cell signaling cascades. They're perceived by receptors in our bodies and can literally make us feel better. And this is sort of the idea of like aromatherapy type stuff. But you can get free aromatherapy by just going out into nature and being around the trees that produce these molecules that, actually literally physically make you feel better. I know it feels nice to go out and see nature, but there's like physiological consequences of all of this. And same thing with the noise. Hearing noises of like a stream bubbling or crickets chirping or birds singing is going to really help lower like your cortisol levels. You can suppress the sympathetic nervous system. You can, increase your immune function. All of these things by simply like being around nature, being present with being outside, can have really positive health benefits. So I think all that stuff is really cool. And it's awesome to me that it's been codified in science and shown through research that this is not just like a hippie thing that, oh yeah, nature's good for you. Like, no, it's physically good for us to be in nature. And again, I think that's very much a function of the fact that humans have evolved in nature and not in fluorescent environments, not in indoors. We should be breathing fresh air. We should be not inhaling lots of noxious fumes. Just go outside. And I wouldn't say touch grass because grass can actually give you kind of a weird rash. Grass is not great stuff, but native plants, trees, mushrooms, all these things are really nice to be around. I would advise it's usually safe to touch most mushrooms, but don't go around touching random plants if you don't know what they are, because some plants are quite dangerous to touch and give you a very serious rash or worse. There's stinging nettle, there's poison ivy, there's poison oak, all sorts of stuff in the plant kingdom that are fairly problematic if you touch them. Whereas with mushrooms, it's generally safe to touch pretty much all mushrooms. There's one or two that might give you a little bit of a rash if you're sensitive, but again, I think if you wash your hands, you'll be fine. So we're going to talk a little bit more about mushrooms and mental health, but from the perspective of psilocybin and that effect that it can have on our brains. So psilocybin is a alkaloid from psilocybe mushrooms. It's present in other mushrooms, and I've talked a lot more about psilocybin on episode 7 of this podcast. So you can go back and listen to that episode to sort of hear my whole thoughts on the genus and all this other stuff. But I'm going to be specifically talking about a few medical studies that were done here, and then following up just with a little bit of kind of advice and the way I view it. So the reason that psilocybin has been chosen to be studied of all the psychedelics by Johns Hopkins was because it was safer than ketamine, ketamine is another I think it's a horse tranquilizer, but it has been used for the same kind of psychedelic type therapy and research. But psilocybin is safer than ketamine, has a lower LD50, has less long-term effects. It can come from a natural source, which again, it can mean it could be more variable. And I'll talk a little bit later about entourage effects and what that might mean for different types of psilocybin mushrooms, stuff like that. But generally, I think psilocybin is one of the safest drugs that human beings consume. It's very low likelihood of actually causing any death. I don't think there's any threshold you can pass that would physically kill you, because it doesn't affect like any of the receptors in your brain. You could easily cause yourself to have like a mental break if you overshot it, and that's where like dose and setting are all really important, but we'll talk about that. It is relatively safe, and it was chosen by Johns Hopkins to do a study. And so the active component, which is what's active in our brains, is psilocybin gets turned into psilocin, 4-OH dimethyltryptamine, which is a non-selective 2A receptor agonist, similar to serotonin. So it hits the same receptors as serotonin, but it floods your brain with lots of it. And the sort of physiological consequences of having this in your brain, and this comes from like a 2017 study on psychedelic psilocybin, is massive increased blood flow to all parts of the brain. And this is consistent with increased brain activity and connectivity across different spheres of your brain that may not normally be communicating. Generally, they see a decrease in the activity of the default mode network, which is sort of a core part of your brain that is thought to be sort of the seat of consciousness. So usually when you're having like very like intense self-reflective thoughts, you see a lot of brain activity bouncing back between like the default mode network. And when you take something like a psychedelic, this is a fairly broad consequence of psychedelics in general, is you see a dampening of the activity in the default mode network and lighting up of the rest of the brain. And what they call that is modular disintegration, which is kind of a weird sciencey way of saying, you know, your default mode network shuts down, and other things are lighting up, which is called global integration, because all of these other parts of your brain are now cross-talking and communicating in ways that they might not normally do, because you've introduced this molecule which is affecting the receptors in your brain. But from the same study, they saw sort of a post-trip after consuming the psychedelic, there was a strengthening of this default mode network integrity. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Their proposed idea was that like taking the psychedelic was kind of like a reset switch, because it depressed the action of the default mode network, and then afterwards it could kind of like, you know, the default mode network would rise back up as you were then processing all of the other things that happened in your brain. And I think that's important, because when I talk about these other studies that Johns Hopkins did, there was a lot of follow-up therapy that went around the actual consumption of mushrooms and the trip itself. So from the initial study in 2020 that was published by Johns Hopkins, there was 24 participants that finished the study. They conducted 2 sessions, I think one with 20 milligrams per 70 kilograms of body weight, and another one with 30 milligrams of per 70 kilograms of body weight, which are decent doses of psilocybin. I mean, that'll definitely make you trip. This is not a microdose. That's an actual dose. I believe they were using Psilocybe cubensis. They were powered up and put in small capsules, and the people consumed them. I think the important part of these studies is that when people took these drugs, they had pre-sessions with a therapist where they discussed their issues. They had a session of actually consuming the drug, which was then followed up by talking to a therapist. They had another session with the drug, again with a therapist present. And then afterwards, they have several successive sessions after the trip experience to help them kind of process and integrate their experiences on the trip. And I think that's really important because that kind of therapy and ability to talk about your experience of what you had during the trip can really enhance the therapeutic benefit of taking a sort of serotonin, serotogenic psychedelic in this way. Just taking the drug on its own doesn't necessarily help you tackle anything. And like the results of this study were very compelling, and society lit up as suddenly everyone was talking about magic mushrooms and how good they could be for you and how they could help people cure depression. And I think from the results of some of these studies, they have seen that people who have depression respond differently, even the chemistry of their brains and the different parts of their brain that are getting activated to the presence of psilocybin. And it's often like the cementing of the default mode network and lack of other activity in your brain that is one of the hallmarks of depression. And you just have these obsessive repetitive thought loops going on. So the idea that you could depress the activity of the default mode network, increase the other parts of your activity of your brain, is kind of the idea that maybe it's a reset switch for some of these depressive tendencies. And certainly that's been the result of some of the research, has said that it can help people who have these treatment-resistant depression symptoms where they've taken all these different drugs and nothing has really seemed to help them get back on an even keel. And what you might need is kind of smash the hard reset button in your brain and let all these other parts of your brain get some blood, get some activity, start thinking about it. But again, like I was talking about, it's not just the drug. It's just a tool that we're using to assist with psychotherapy. And I think what people lose focus on a lot too is that you can easily accomplish what happens in a mushroom trip with a lot of psychotherapy. But the issue is that can take many years, potentially, depending on the particular trauma or thing that you're working on. Some people are going to be resistant to it anyhow, and it's really, really expensive to get therapy, whereas a single trip might be much more affordable for certain people. But that being said, there can be negative consequences from taking this drug as well. There was a 2022 follow-up study to the Johns Hopkins thing, and I think what they basically saw is they did this with another group of people, saw similar results of them alleviating people's depression, this major depressive disorders, and some of those effective treatments were good for up to about 12 months. So in a therapeutic setting with the double dose, they saw positive effects for up to 12 months afterwards, and even potentially longer than that. I think 12 months is just how long they followed people. But there are more studies going on now with much larger groups. One that I was reading about is Compass Pathways, which I believe is a company that is trying to sort of monetize magic mushrooms. They are looking at, I think, breeding different types of mushrooms and thinking specifically about the chemistry of particular magic mushrooms and what they call the entourage chemistry, the other types of molecules that are present in there that might be affecting the way that the psilocybin or the psilocin is getting processed in our brain. So you can have it's called like an allosteric modulator of an enzyme. So the receptor is sitting there waiting for the sort of serotonin-like molecule, the psilocin, to enter. But you might have another molecule that comes by and affects the binding pocket so that the psilocin, stays in there longer or less time, and that can change the effect. So the other kinds of molecules that are present in a mushroom or in a combination of drugs that you might be taking can drastically affect the experience of the person taking it. So thinking about the entourage effects is going to be really interesting as we look at the business side of how magic mushrooms are being kind of monetized by different companies. Different companies may come up with their own proprietary blends. Whether it's good or bad, I don't have like a moral standing on that. I do think it's interesting because different species of psilocybin mushrooms definitely have different entourage effects, and you'll hear very different things about people's experiences with, cubensis versus cyanescens versus alinei versus azarescens. But a lot of it too has to do with the person and the set and the setting as well. So there's a lot of complicated factors here, and I definitely like encourage people to do a lot of research if you are interested in taking psilocybin to treat depression. I think it's really important to look at the studies and mimic some of what they're doing in terms of having like talk therapy, having very dedicated like time and space to do these things, understanding your dosage, understanding the concentration, understanding your own internal struggles, maybe before you try to take a drug that's going to just completely turn your brain to soup and stir things up. You want to know what you're going to be dealing with, because I think if you're in a really dark place, it's not necessarily a great idea to do mushrooms, because people can get more depressed if they're already really depressed. You want to be in an okay space where you have the capacity to tackle some of the difficult things that you might be dealing with. So in this Compass Pathway study, this is I think the largest study done to date, but it's 233 patients. Whereas these other Johns Hopkins ones were like 25 people roughly. And in this study, they gave people like 25, 10, and 1 milligram doses. And I don't know if that's by body weight or exactly what it was. But they did see that the higher doses were more effective at alleviating depression. So that's something. And again, I think that's like, if you're having a single dose, a higher dose is probably more likely to help you alleviate that depression. But if you're thinking about like, hey, I have chronic depression and maybe I don't want to have just one gigantic trip and try to be over it all at once, maybe I want to try something like microdosing, where I'm like chipping away bit by bit at this big block of depression. And so there's different ways to do this. You can try a big singular experience. You could try multiple smaller experiences. Again, those Johns Hopkins ones were sort of 2 experiences. I don't know what the period of time between them, maybe a month or something like that. But like taking something and letting your body process, letting your brain process what's going on can be useful too. But the bigger the depression, maybe the more mushrooms you might need to kind of unblock this depressive episode or to help reset your brain. And that's a thing to think about. Again, this is something I would caution you, talk to professionals about, talk to doctors about, if you're in a place where you can have that kind of discussion, because again, psilocybin is a illegal drug in most of the United States. There are certain areas where it has been decriminalized. There's Oregon, which passed this 109 measure, and hopefully we'll see a legal path to psilocybin therapy in the near future. But we're not there yet. So again, you have to be very careful when you talk about this kind of stuff. And if you're going to do reading on it and you're going to look at books and things like that, you want to make sure that you're reading credible sources. And ideally, what you can do is look at some of these academic studies that have been conducted and try to mimic the same kinds of behavior that they're doing. So from this Compass Pathways thing, I just wanted to point out that there were 24 people who withdrew with symptoms, side effects, and most of those were like headache, nausea, fatigue, insomnia. So it can negatively impact your mental state potentially, and that's something to be aware of, is that psilocybin mushrooms may not be for everybody, especially if you're already on like an SSRI. Don't do psilocybin. That's a bad idea. There can be weird interactions. And there were 12 people who reported severe effects, thoughts of suicide, but those are the people who are already like very severely clinically depressed. And that's kind of what I was saying, is if you're not in a great space and you are very depressed already, maybe it's not a great idea to try mushrooms to solve a problem. And I've had that issue once where I thought I was in this very sad place and I was like, maybe I'll just like do a mushroom trip and push through and get over it. Didn't help. Definitely made things worse. I was really sad. And I learned a lesson that day. You can't circumvent bad feelings. Sometimes you just have to sit there with those bad feelings and recognize them and look at them and understand that they feel bad and that you feel bad, and that's life. But also know that those feelings will pass, and sometimes you just have to breathe. And that's where getting out to nature, going for a walk, that's the tool that you can use to help you get catharsis, how you can help yourself move on from something that just seems so overwhelming and sad. Go outside, look at some plants, find a mushroom, get a little spark of serotonin in your brain again. It's all good. So This is an open research topic. There's a lot more data forthcoming, and I'm really excited to see that we're finally able to have a discourse about this in society. You know, back in like the 50s and 60s, there's a fair bit of work going on with mental health and psychedelics, and unfortunately, that was shut down because of this very unfair, unjust ban on sort of all psychedelics. We really need to see a change in the scheduling of these drugs. I am severely hoping that when more results from these clinical studies come out, that the federal government will change the scheduling of psilocybin in particular, and hopefully other entheogens, psychedelics that have been classified as a Schedule 1 drug, which is a straight felony, down to like a, I think, Schedule 4 maybe, which is something that does have medical benefit, because these things clearly do have a medical benefit. From a skeptical perspective, there was another study that came out that said that there was no significant effect of magic mushrooms on treatment-resistant depression. I couldn't find that study as I was doing my research here, but I do remember reading about it. And so there's always something, you read once more, and you can't take less if you took a lot, but if you didn't take enough, you can always take a little bit more and extend your experience. There's also very different things that happen when you are taking them in different forms. So if they're little powdered capsules, or you're eating straight mushrooms, or you're making a tea, all of those things can hit you differently. And so it's good to do a little bit of research into like what way you might want to consume them. You can and should definitely engage in talk therapy as it relates to what you're dealing with, and the ways that you think about things will be very much cemented by the conversations you have around this topic. You should definitely go out and do some nature bathing, practice some mindfulness, do good mental health practices in general, in addition to your psilocybin therapy, because I think all this stuff can be used to help drastically improve mental health. Not all of this is going to be the same for everybody. Everyone's going to have a different matrix, a different brain. Just do the best thing you can for you. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say about mental health and mushrooms. And I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to me kind of rant about the subject. It's certainly near and dear to my heart, as I said. And I'm gonna be thinking about it. Be thinking about you guys. Hoping everyone is doing okay out there. But sending you all much love. I'll be back next week. I think next week I'm going to talk about the mycology community and sort of the culture around mushrooms that I find really fascinating, and all the different interesting people and festivals and things that happen with regards to mushrooms. So anyhow, this is Dr. Gordon Walker signing off, and I hope you guys have a good week. Bye-bye.